Okay, let's go with this one. Kurt Von Arnold says, how do I reconcile my belief that free market capitalism is an absolute good, lifting more people out of poverty than any other system, with my desire to protect the jobs and livelihoods of my fellow citizens from competing markets that are destroying them? And I assume he means overseas markets, although certainly it's possible to lose your job to domestic competition as well. Well, first of all, we have to understand that as much as I love this country and as much as I love capitalism, and I sure do love them both, I don't believe that we've ever had free market capitalism in America. There is a remarkable book. I've interviewed the author of it a couple times on PJTV. I highly recommend it. I'm embarrassed I don't have his name in front of me, but I do remember the book, and it's called The Myth of the Robber Barons. If you go look at The Myth of the Robber Barons, what that will show you is that all throughout the history of capitalism in America, which is the example and the model for capitalism and wealth generation throughout the world, what you find is that there were two different kinds of people, and the author of this book, who hopefully somebody will be able to provide me with in a minute here, was very, very clear on this, and he put them in a way I'd never thought of him before, but it's a very, very illuminating and insightful way to think of things. Bert Folsom, thank you, Wild Goose. Bert Folsom said that there were two kinds of entrepreneurs during the age of the so-called robber barons who weren't really robber barons. He said they were political entrepreneurs and market entrepreneurs. And political entrepreneurs were people who, like Robert Fulton, who invented the steamboat, and then he basically went to the government, in that case it was a state government in New York, and said, hey, I've got a steamboat, and how about if you license me and legally say I'm the only guy who can run a steamboat up and down this route on these rivers in New York, and in exchange for this license, I will pay you a percentage of the fares. And the same thing was true with the sorry, I almost did it. I caught myself. The president didn't, but I did. The Transcontinental Railroad, same thing was true with that, where the Union Pacific and the Union Pacific and Western Pacific were fighting to meet in the middle of the country, and they were getting enormous subsidies from the government. But along comes a guy, back to the steamboat, for example, along comes Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was in fact a market entrepreneur, looked at the collusion between government and business that Fulton had, and basically said, well, I'm locked out of competing with this guy. I don't have the subsidies from the government, so I'm going to have to carry more passengers, which means I'm going to have to charge a lower rate, and that means I'm going to have to be far more efficient. Vanderbilt then took that attitude later into the transatlantic trade, because the British had subsidized the mail route from Britain to America with Cunard lines. We had a subsidized route ourselves. And basically, Vanderbilt said, I'm going to carry mail for free, and I'm going to cut the transatlantic fares by a factor of 90%. And what ended up happening was everybody got to ride, and he made more money, and he put the subsidized guys out of business because he appealed to the people. It was a Great Northern Railroad was the one that James J. Hill built. Thanks, Dave Olson. Another example of a guy who used his own money. And in the case of Vanderbilt using his own money, Hill using his own money, and all of these market entrepreneurs who use their own money, they provided better service and better quality and better safety because they had to. Since they were using their own money, the railroad that James Hill built, the Great Northern, for example, was laid out far more efficiently than the ones that the two big government-sponsored railroads were, because the government-sponsored railroads understood that the market was from the government. So the faster they could put track down, the more money they got, the more land grants they got. That meant they didn't have to be very efficient in terms of the surveying, didn't have to be very efficient in terms of the quality of the rail. But when they were laying down the private railroad, he had to make it absolutely as level as he could. He had to make the grades as low as he could. He had to use the highest quality rails that he could. And because he built a much better railroad technologically, I mean to say, he was able to charge a lower rate. And that lower rate meant that he could outcompete the guys even with a subsidy. And finally, the guys with a subsidy offered to pay him a huge part of the subsidy to get out of business. Did the same thing again and again and again, all over the board. So please read Myth of the Robber Barons by Folsom, Dr. Folsom, because it really explains this for you, Kurt. And I want to get into it a little bit more. To say simply this: when a person loses their job under the ideal free market, one of two things is happening. they're losing their job to a company that is out competing them. They're just selling better widgets or better cars, or it's a better restaurant. Think about this. Nobody really talks about this. I can't remember if this was in Dr. Folsom's book or not, but if you have two restaurants on the same block and one of them is just jammed all the time and you can't get in and the other one's going out of business, why is that? It's the same location, it's the same clientele, same customers, same neighborhood. Somebody's doing an awful lot better job of providing a service than the other guy. And they're succeeding, and people are voting with their wallets and with their feet. So, generally speaking, when you have the ability to compete freely, losing a job to competition means the market is growing. It means that business is growing, and people who are fired don't normally get executed. This business about allowing GM to go bankrupt, that Romney got into such trouble for. People talked about Romney saying this as if Romney meant, let's allow GM to go bankrupt, which means we'll bulldoze all the factories down and we'll line all the people up and push them over a cliff. That's not what he was talking about at all. He was talking about bankruptcy as a legal declaration, which meant that he could renegotiate contracts. It allowed him to renegotiate a contract at a better rate. So when you talk about friends losing jobs to competition, that actually is good for everybody. Competition lowers the rates for everybody, makes everything less expensive. This cell phone costs what it costs, not because Apple's kindness. This cell phone costs what it costs because the Apple iPhone is priced because of Samsung. If Samsung wasn't there, then they could charge whatever they want for this thing. So competition actually helps everybody's lives by lowering prices across the board and raising quality at the same time. When you get the government involved in this process, you don't have capitalism anymore, or free market capitalism as we understand it. We have what's often called crony capitalism, which we shouldn't use because there's no capitalism as far as we're concerned. People just taint the term. The correct term for that is mercantilism. That's where the government basically takes money from big companies. They use that money to get elected. Once elected, they write laws that keep the competition away from those big companies. And GM doesn't have to compete because GM is legally protected. And that goes all the way down to little things like a hairstylist and their license. Have you ever gotten to somebody for a haircut? Have you ever gone to a hairdresser or gotten a haircut based on the certificate on the wall? Have you ever gone and said, I've heard that the Davidson School of Cosmetology is the best school there is. Which school did you go to? No one does that. Everybody gets a personal recommendation from friends. This guy's really good. And things like licenses like that keep competition out of the market, which is why the people in business like it. The governments like it because it gives them more power, and they like power, and it gives them licensing fees and fines, both of which they like. So there's that kind of competition.